The original factory is fantastic. It serves its purpose. It has allowed us to go from multiple phases of the space elevator and learn new techniques, but it is time to upgrade. Nearby, I've been working on a new factory which takes care of everything that the already existing factory has been doing, but way, way prettier. Now, it may not be much to look at from the outside, but it's what's on the inside that counts, right? You can already see that we have an unusual amount of conveyor belts crisscrossing the ceiling, but they do serve a purpose. So let's start with the input side, the resources. This structure is where the resources converge to enter the factory. In front of us we have the 2 conveyor belts for the iron. We have one of limestone and one of copper. Now you can see that most everything is unfinished. Please excuse my dust because I am not able to show you a finished product of this factory since I'm still unlocking the things that I need in order to complete it. Now over to the right you can see some coal and water also entering the factory. This is really crucial because it means that it is able to be self-sufficient and generate its own power. On the top floor, coal and water are funneled towards the coal generators. Currently there are 4, but there is enough room here to add an additional 6 or so that we can have enough power for anything that comes next. 5 conveyor elevators take the remaining resources down to the 2nd floor, which is the main factory floor. It would be a long and tedious process to explain every individual function of every structure inside the factory, but I'm just going to go over the highlights. On the left you have the copper, then we have some concrete next to it, iron, and then finally steel on the far right. Resource distribution to the smelters is straightforward, but for the foundries it's a little bit more complicated. The reason for this is because the foundries require the coal, but the coal generators on the 2nd floor, which generate the electricity, also require coal and they need priority. So in order to give them priority, we have the coal exiting the overpass and the resource distribution going to the 2nd floor first, conveying over towards the right, and then the leftover is given to the 2 foundries. After the foundries and the smelters produce the iron ingots, copper ingots, and steel ingots, those ingots move into a row of constructors which refine the material. They then move into either another constructor for further refinement or an assembler which combines 2 separate components, and then finally another row of assemblers which is further creating more advanced materials. Now it would be pretty straightforward if each foundry and smelter could produce an assembly line of its own, but because of the assemblers we're requiring multiple inputs, so some materials have to exit an assembler or constructor and then move over to another side of the factory, thereby requiring this intensely insane network of conveyor belts. The conveyor system is even further complicated by the requirement of having to export all the materials and components produced here to another factory. So not only do these constructors have to output these materials to another constructor or assembler in the facility, they also have to conveyor them to a storage area, which is going to allow us to transport these materials to other factories where other resources are going to be available, where they can be combined with other products from those factories and produce even more advanced materials. Therefore, everything we produce here in the factory is going to be conveyed down to this floor, which is going to be another distribution network, which is going to send some of the materials into storage containers like this one, but it's also going to be able to allow us to create a new train station, which is going to automatically load all of these components onto a monorail system, which will then be able to automatically deliver them to the factories where they're needed. It would likely take over an hour to explain every single conveyor belt in this factory, so let's just go over a couple to give you the general idea. So right here in front of us we have the copper ore entering one of the smelters, which is producing the copper ingots, and then going in here and producing some of the copper sheets. This is a pretty easy one because as far as I know there are no uses for the copper sheets in this factory. So those are just simply output to this conveyor system, which is crossing backwards, going up, across, and then down this elevator. However, things get complicated very quickly. In front of us is a constructor producing the copper wire. That is then splitting off in 2 different directions. Towards the left, it is going up over our heads, and then down towards one of the elevators, sending it to the basement for storage and then export. But then it also splits off to the right, and taking one of these conveyor networks over to the far right of the factory. After their long journey to the right side of the steel production, they then take another elevator down into this assembler, where they're joining with the steel pipes and producing the stators. But that's not the end of the story, because those stators are needed further down the assembly line. So we have the same situation where the product is exiting this assembler and is being split off in 2 directions. Over top, it is going all the way back to the other side of the factory into the storage and export network down below, but then they are also being sent into this assembler, which is producing a more advanced product in the form of the motors. So then that has to split off as well. Now at this point we don't have a secondary use for the motors, so it only has to go one direction, down towards the bottom, heading all the way back down to the other side of the factory, down to the basement, and then it will enter the train station or storage network. If you follow the route of 1 or 2 components, things are pretty straightforward, but if you multiply that by 10 and end up with the nearly 20 components which are going to be produced in this factory, you end up with an extremely complicated network of conveyor belts, which are even hard for me to follow. In this factory, we're operating with 4 blocks of vertical space. That's essentially 4 floors, and I wanted that amount because in the previous factory we had 3. I figured by bumping up that by 1, we could create even more connections and make things a little bit cleaner. Now, I also could have gone down with some of these conveyor belts. It would have been very easy to open up a hole in the floor and then send a conveyor belt all the way from one side of the factory to the other, thereby increasing the complexity of this network exponentially. But the reason I didn't do that is because my other philosophy in building the space was going to be appearances, and I didn't want just random holes in the middle of the factory, which would A, create difficulty going from one floor to the next, and B, creating just a visual eyesore. So the only way that things are going down a floor is on this network of conveyor systems, which are going to send the components down to the bottom floor for export. The next construction philosophy was to operate on a grid system. You can see at the very beginning of the factory we have this row of foundries and smelters going all the way down the factory, giving one room of space into the next row of constructors or assemblers, and then another block for space. This area here is actually open because this constructor just produces the copper sheets, which at this factory don't have a secondary production line. So then we're having the spacing and then another row of the constructors, assemblers, etc., etc. Now going to see the columns, you can see that we have the same thing going on. We have the row of machines, a space, row of machines, a space, a row of machines, etc., etc. Now I was hoping that the spacing that I provided was going to be enough for the conveyor systems, but it is coming close to maxing out the room that I have available. There are some tweaks that you can do in this game to get conveyor belts to actually go through each other, but one of the things that I didn't want to do was to create any conveyor belts which were actually sloped. You can very easily just come here, create a conveyor belt system that's going to look like that and is going to function just fine, but I didn't like the way that that looked, so instead I'm limiting myself by having to actually create elevators for everything, and unfortunately elevators cannot go up a single level. They're constrained by their size and they have to go up 2. So I'm unable to use some of these rungs of the conveyor belt supports, which is making things more complicated, but overall I like the way that it makes the factory look, with everything being very flat and horizontal in terms of conveyor belts, and also not creating difficulty in terms of having to navigate, because you're able to have a little bit more headroom, and while some of the areas do get kind of complicated to try and jump through, it is relatively straightforward compared to some of the other systems and other factories that I've created. Going along with the philosophy of keeping everything aesthetically pleasing, I've also tried to create a lot of parallel lines with the conveyor belts. You can see that there are a couple of these stacks of conveyor belts going across the factory, and while that may not be the best way to get these things from A to B, I do think it looks really nice when you look across the factory. Now, some of the reason that I think this is helpful is because I did build in these rows of empty spaces, and that allows me to create these really tall stacks of conveyor belts. But the problem with that is that because I'm not using any conveyor belt slopes, I'm having to use a lot of the elevators, and they take up a lot of space, and they're also stopping me from taking up certain areas of the factory into like that first level that we talked about. So it makes things more difficult, but I think overall it also makes things look really nice. Here's another area where you can see a lot of the parallel lines of the conveyors. In this case, you're seeing all the resources enter the factory. And finally, the pièce de résistance of the factory is this, all the conveyor elevators sending the finished components down to the bottom floor for export. I really like the way that these conveyor elevators almost present them to the player at this angle. I almost want to consider this like a trophy case for the factory. So where does that leave us with Factory 2.0? Well, you can see that it's not quite finished yet. There are a couple more components that we can create with the resources in this area. However, some of them are restricted by having to research additional tiers, which will come in future videos. And once we're able to create all of those components, we'll finish off the conveyor network to send them down to the bottom floor, create a distribution system to send them to either storage or export via a monorail system. Then once we build up the train station, we'll have to buff up the electrical system on the second floor, add some more coal generators to make sure all the electrical needs of the factory are taken care of. And then once that is finalized, we'll be able to add some walls to this building, maybe add a lot of glass, make it very airy and open, and hopefully lamps come soon, because this is a really tough area to work with at night. You're just constantly bumping into all the conveyor belts and some of the platforms. it gets pretty rough. But I'm glad that we have this new factory. It, despite looking extremely complicated, is actually going to be able to provide a more efficient network of production for everything compared to that first factory, and it's going to provide a really nice system to build off of for future videos. So thank you so much for joining me on this tour of Factory 2.0. Only good things to come, and hopefully this has you excited for the other factories that we're going to have to create, including the refineries, the Caterium ore processing network, the quartz. They're all going to have to be some kind of upgrade like this. So this is just the first factory in a network of factories to come. If that doesn't have you excited, I don't know what will. So thank you for watching this episode, and I'll see you in the next one.